How's it going, everyone? Welcome, Eulier Gonzalez. I don't wanna. I just want this first section of this video show something that I do think that is going to explain why we're doing the thing that I'm doing here, at least for this series of videos, right? Or reading this particular book uh, written by Kyle Simpson, a software engineer with more than 20 years of experience, uh, that actually describe is the important to understand is not only the high level features of JavaScript as well as the low level features, but also is to the environments around this. So the non-technical aspects. So the quote quote soft aspect here, right? So for example, in terms of who made that, who are the people who oversee this, as well as the legal trademarks, who owns that, so what is that? Uh, but in this video, I just want to focus my attention is on this little bit of React conference. Why is that? Well, because this is a conference that is still relevant in the spy, well, like 11 years. After 11 years, Jesus, this is still being relevant, and not only by the system that they make and so on and so forth, but it's because of the approach or the reality, the vision that Pete Hunt, as well as Chen, and I don't remember his name, sorry, my bad, uh, when it comes to actually is now build system that allows you at the end of the day easily to change or to modify is the UI of our applications, as well as make it that is scalable. And this is the kind of question, this is the kind of problems that not only Facebook has, all right, but if at some point, if you are now, whether it's a SMB or aka small and mid business, or a big corporations, you would then start to realize this scalability issues, man. And it all boils down to understand that why React, especially Pete Hunt, make the decisions to create this nice things little wrapper around the components and heavily use heavily use is functions and objects rather than any other layer on the architecture and so on and so forth. Why is that? Because this has shown now that is a very good way. It is so you'll miss the 50 and 60 years of software development of how do we abstract things in our programs. And that is my banding, bro. As you go in, as you dive into this, uh, and which is something that I'm doing here, not only in this particular video, but the subsequent videos, and as a way to know is understand that, right? Is because of that. Is I do want to now solve once and for all my issues that I have, at least in this field, right? And then, so let those companies now figuring out what will be the best approach for writing UI interface and so on and so forth, right? It is more like to with the goal of providing more interactivity to the user applications. One, and as you do this, make it as scalable and easy to maintain. This is the two core things that no matter at which company you are going to work, right? At the end of the day, if you are using a particular framework, you are married with their ideas and stuff like that. which is in the case of React, and I do think that this is quite compelling, I'm aligned to that, right? I'm aligned to what others have done, so we can be on this moment. So, AKA, we are here. Thanks. So I am here uh, because I am on the top of shoulders giants, and despite that these marketing ideas and sales speech that I can say that is because I genuinely believe, and there is not even belief, that it is what it is. So the Pete Hunt described something that is very interesting, which is, how do I know, or the subtle difference here of Angular and React and now also Vue, right? Is that how do we can, or how this React and Angular compare to each other, right? Back in like 11 years ago, 2014, holy moly. Anyway,
So I've used Angular. It looks quite similar. Can you compare and contrast your stuff versus Angular?
Versus Angular. So the question was comparing and contrasting React and Angular and Flux, and React plus Flux and Angular. They're fundamentally kind of, they do solve some of the same problems, but they go at it at very different ways. So React is focused a lot on treating your code as a black box. So there's no sort of observable abstraction inside of React. You simply say, hey, re-render the UI, and you present a consistent view of what you want your UI to look like. With Angular, you are versus Angular.
He mentioned is that this black box.
They're fundamentally kind of, they do solve some of the same problems, but they go at it at very different ways. So React is focused a lot on treating your code as a black box. So there's no sort of observable abstraction inside of React. You simply say, hey, re-render the UI, and you present a consistent view of what you want your UI to look like. With Angular, you are basically passing data throughout these things called scopes, which observe your data model. And I think that that's a very leaky abstraction. It forces you to compose your application not in terms of functions and objects, but in terms of directives and model view controller and their flavor of model view controller.
This is exactly what he mentioned here. In this fundamental of modeling your applications in functions, model the application. The word here of model is to describe is that these things actually work as vectors, right? The model here, and what the model is trying to do, right, is to look at a particular problem and describe that based on this, whatever it is in our case is the UI. So hey, do we have this particular problem? Hey, let's go to now model this UI in terms of functions and objects, instead of miss of the past 40 and 50 years of software developments to encapsulate our programs for maintainability. Okay, instead of now using some stuff that might work for using high level architecture. That's what I think that is the fundamental here, which is true. I have experience working in Angular and Vue and say, hey, yes, you are not going to model is your entire application is, in the case of Vue, is based on the state or the reactive reference that they like to call. And in the case of React or Angular, you do now have is this particularly component where in order to detect change, they're going to now scope that and going to observe that. Which in the case of React, you say, no, let's gonna put everything of that is related to this data binding at the end of the push all of this data binding away from React, or as much as possible away from React, So we can now is focus on this declarative user interface. And when you need to render that particular snippet, well, we can actually do that.
So while it does work for a certain class of applications, as you scale up, you start to miss the past 40 or 50 years of research into how to abstract a program. And so if you can kind of push those, push that kind of data binding concern out to the edges of your system like React does, I think it leads to faster iteration time.
And the whole point of this is leads to fast iteration time. That's the whole point of building this kind of stuff. Is like you are going to build this application, whatever it is. And the end of the day, what we want to do is that the ability to iterate quickly on this development, and not only that, but also is for the sake of building features or deploying some features or fixing the code or find a way to do some house cleaning. But the thing is that whatever thing that you want to do with the code, do that in the most faster way possible. So speed up the development. So in that regard, because at the end of the day, our job, all right, is to, well, I don't think this is a job, but if you are in the software development industry, we are building is products, whatever product it is, right? No matter which product it is, whatever product it is. So because of that, all right, now and after exploring the second book about the scopes and the closures, and understand that working with variables is one of the most important things that you do in your programs. It is also important to understand the anatomy of a program, at least in JavaScript, be able to describe how these programs behave in JavaScript, how you can cooperate among different programs. What is the anatomy of this program, which is made of values that you can define, as well as syntax that allow you to perform now some actions or statements, and it also is some declarations. So we have now this, and we deep dive into the values and what are the different type of values that we can have on JavaScript. So primitive and object. So what is an object? What kind of object do we can we have, like an array or functions or a map and set, and understand what an array is, and also specifically what functions are, and how you can now use these functions, whether it's you declare a function or you assign that into a variables, and what a variable is and what a variables behave, and the different syntax forms of the variables, aka the var, let, const, and also what is the operations that we can do in these values, okay, such as the changing the value from another, coerce that, or comparing those values, whether it's a primitive and an object, and how that actually works, all right? And then also understand the different type of way to organize our code, which is exactly what Pete described, all right? So here in JavaScript we have is, well, whether it is a function or a class or a ESC model, which is something that is recent to the language, not that from ES6, all right? And also it's the low-level features currently in JavaScript that allow us to is, for example, iterate through elements what is an iterator, what is an iterable, and also, well, understand now the anatomy of this particular value, particularly the functions. Uh, that is the closure, which is what we're going to see in today's video, and the other is the the closure and the value of this, okay, as well as another the anatomy of another value, which is objects. All right, and for example, what is the prototype chains works, and what is this prototype chains, and how you can now combine is the prototype chain with the function this, as a way to now is enhance the applications, enhance the program of your applications, and nevertheless is add as you see fit data and dynamically, and anytime that you call a function you can have access to that data dynamically. This can be quite a nightmare to do so, and especially if you don't have some sort of way to document is the value type. That's why TypeScript is the natural step on the language. So in any case, right, we look now at the scope. So what is in the scope? Why is important to understand now what scope is, and especially why we need to look at the scope, but it's because of how JavaScript actually behave, right? Not as a scripting language, but as a compile language. So in this case, that it is useful for us to think that JavaScript now has a compile phase or a parsing phase, where it's gonna analyze certain declarations and then the execution of the code. So this is now based on the observable reality that you have in JavaScript, and that is, hey, what happens when we have a syntax errors, or when we declare variables or parameter names, the same parameter name in functions, all right? Or what happens when we do hoisting, all right? In these three scenarios, JavaScript behave now is as a compiler language, that it has now is a parsing phase, which is going to transform all of your tokens into meaningful tokens into the language, the parsing of the lexeme, and then the once it has all of these streams of valid JavaScript token, it's going to now create this abstract syntax tree that describes now the structure of this program, and then it's usually generate code, at least in the classic compiler theory. So because this JavaScript, at least in V8 engine and other engines, they behave in these particular ways in this kind of scenarios, it is useful for us to think that when you look at certain declarations, or when it now doing some early errors, or detection of early errors or syntax error, right? All of this now is going to happen before the code is evaluated. And then you have now the runtime or the execution of your code. So as we explore now what are these kind of declarations, and what these declarations actually are doing, when you, for example, now declare is a scope, and the way to declare that is via the function, the block, or even inside of the catch and the try catch. All right. So what happened in there is JavaScript create at runtime is this environment record that is used to associate its identifier, aka the names of the variables or functions, uh, to them, right? So it's the association between the identifier to a variable. So why am I mentioning this? You may wonder, because anytime that you create this functions or block, it is creating is this scope, and this scope has certain characteristics. So for example, it allows you to do something known as shadowing, which is a fancy way to say what happens when you have now variables with the same name at different nested scope. So the variables are going to shadow it. You can have access to the previous variable at runtime, at compile time. You know, it is inaccessible lexically. And when you define this particularly nested scope, right, behind the scenes, JavaScript, when it creates this environment record, is going to now have a hidden property known as the outer M that is going to point to the outer enclosing scope. So this is the way of how now JavaScript is going to resolve identifiers when they see that in this deep nested scope, to figuring out if that identifier is along the scope change. So this is important to be able to describe that and to imagine and to have that mental model or that understanding of this, because as we explore is how this scope behave, whether it's a function, whether it's a block, how you can create a function in a block, and especially other implied scopes like the parameters. So don't mess with that. It is important to understand that that exists, but don't mess with that. Also is that scopes now are created with functions declaration and function expression, especially when you put now function name expression. Even arrow function has its own arrow, its own scope. All right, the behaviors might change. So, for example, the value of this is undefined, and also some recommendations of why, when you are going to assign now a functions to a variable, it is preferred to define that, so to set their names. Functions names expressions. First, because it is easy to spot on, it is easy to access to that identifier at compile time, aka lexically, all right, and also is as I mentioned before, it is descriptive of what this function is doing. And most of the time, as JavaScript developers and so on and so forth, we are going to actually dive deep into reading a lot of code. So if the code is so the more the code, the more cleaner the code is, all right, the more cleaner, the more readable the code is, the more straightforward is now with the help with the AI to spot on and to provide some context to the AI, so you can now fix where or fix, updates, enhance, or remove certain features in your applications. Yeah, I do think that's very, very, very compelling. Very, very, very compelling. Absolutely. Absolutely. So here's the thing that as I look that, okay, as I explore into those topics, and so for example, with this in chapter 7, or as I explore of those, the scope anatomy, right? And also another scope, which is more, uh, it is how do you put it? Is an important scope. It is the global scope, all right, which allow is as I mentioned before, I think so, that each one of those different scope, whether it's a blog or the catch in try catch or a function or the global scope, all of them allow us is to define is variables that can cooperate amongst them. And in the case of the global scope, this will allow us to uh, cooperate among different files. So, for example, error tracking, analytics, right? So the way how the global scope allows to do that is whether it's you use now ES models, all right? And then when you use the import keyword, you're going to now is fetch all of these resources as you see fit. And the other is, well, how do I know? Exactly. And the other is that how do I know? Yeah. So how do I know? How do I know that the global scope how do I collaborate? Sorry, how do I collaborate in the global scope among different JavaScript files? So well, one of them is the ES6 right now by using the import keyword. The other is when you, for example, define now a function that enclose is it is modules inside of these functions, and then inside of this enclosing scope they can now collaborate in there, which is effectively now creating is a own enclosing scope, all right, usually via function. And the other is by defining variables at the global state, and then you can now interact with. Okay, so in the case of the global scope, this is also something that is exposed is other things in this global scope. It exposes the intrinsic, as I like to call here, which is this different syntax that you can use that. So for example, var, let, function, cons, for loops, intrinsic. Also, so the JavaScript syntax, the JavaScript syntax, which is something that is here. Let me see if I can pull it over here. So the JavaScript syntax, all right, the JavaScript primitive, the native, for example, like date or objects or strings or numbers, the global functions like math, atomic, JSON. There's an other as well, reflect, and some friends of JavaScript. Now, for example, internationalization and WebAssembly. And also the environment. This is what JavaScript exposed. What is the building things that JavaScript exposed, right? So in terms of the syntax, the values, the building objects, all right, or the native objects. So like date, objects, strings, the global functions like the eval and parse ins. Some of the next space, Math, Atomic, and JSON, and this Friends of JavaScript, as I mentioned here. And also is the host specific environment. So for example, like console, or like set timeouts, like timers, or the DOM, or the web platform APIs, so Navigator, Canvas, geolocation, WebRTC, fetch, etc. Right? So this global scope, where they live? Well, in the context of the browser, depending of the environment that you're running, this environment expose certain APIs, all right, and also it allow you to have access to them, depend of the environment. So depend of the environment, for example, like the global scope in the browser, where it allows you to now define some variables via var or function and attach that to the window global object. You can do this shadowing to the window global object. And also it allows you to access to elements by its ID via the window object. That to me was mind bending when I figuring it out, and it makes a lot of sense to do so. And the other is that with the window name, the variable name here, because it's now using is the window.name, the predefined that. The other environment is the web workers, where here when you define again a variable and a function again in its behavior predictable as the web, all right. So each one of those identifiers will be now attached to the global objects, which is the self, all right. Just as with many JavaScript programs, var and function declaration can create mirror property of the global objects, where other declaration let in cons do not, right? Again, this mirror variables, as he mentioned here, so it create mirror properties in the global data, but only with var and let. All right. So here say recall from chapter 1, get started, the developer tools that don't create completely adhering JavaScript environments, and they do process JavaScript code, but they also lean in favor of user interactions being most friendly to developers. So with respect to our discussion here about scope, such observable difference in behavior might be the behavior of the global scope, hosting, see chapter 5, and block scoping declarators like let and cons, and see chapter 6. When we're using the outermost scope, so for example, if we say something like this, you say let with a variable counter, right? 1 start from 0. All right. If you think that you might have access to that counter, there doesn't exist, right? It not mirror that to the window or to the global object. It works as expected as a global environment, which is the browser and or the web worker. Makes a lot of sense. And then developer tool console rep like this. Diggy diggy. So it mentioned is this block scoping declarator let and count, see chapter 6, when used in outermost scope. And also it might seem while using the rel console rel, the statement entirely is in the outer mode scope.
Hola.
¿Sí?
Oh, hola, ¿qué tal? Hola, ¿qué fue? Me acabo de librar.
All right, and we're back. Cool. So yeah, so now, well, also describing is another. There is also a reason why this actually is not a good place to test, only for a small set of construct, right? And I mentioned is this. To just only show is this. Right. You can have access to the global window object, but not to the disk value here. So again, and in here, right, with ES model, there is no top level place to attach your functions, right? What you can, or there is no global space or global variable, global scope to share that. Especially when you create now a variable or a function. But what you do, or what you can do, is to export them, right? So the model top level scope is descended from the global scope, and almost as it is entire content of a model were wrapped in a function. Thus, all variables that exist in the global scope, whether they are global objects or not, are available as lexical identifier from the inside model scope. ESM encourages a minimization of reliance on the global scope, where you import whatever models you might need to for the current model to operate, and such you less often see uses of the global scope or it is global objects here. However, as noted earlier, there are still plenty of JavaScript and web globals that you continue to access from the global scope, whether you realize or not. And that's why interesting. So you can have access to the global variables, but you can declare that. All right? It's just the global variables you don't create by declaring variables in the top level model, but you can have access to that. And the other is no. So we'd say, hey, which is something that we're going to explore now in chapter 8 more deeply about that environment. And now how the environments is treated, each one of those files is treated as a single program, and as such as a model in itself. Previously CommonJS model, and now an ES6 models. So Node then essentially invokes the added model functions to run your models, and you can clearly see why student names and hellos identifiers are not global, but rather declared in the model scope. So, but in any case, I am mentioning is this quick overview about the global scope and what is the reason of the global scope, and it's because of that, right? That allow us is to define and cooperate among different programs. So this is also not only for the global scope, but for any scope, all right? And because as we look at what is or how these variables behave in this particular scope, all right, specifically how a functions declaration and how a var declaration behave on global scope and function scope or block scope, right? So anytime that you define a variable or a global, it's going to be put at the top function or global scope, and initialize its values as undefined in var, and the function value as the function. So when you, for some reason, do check is the how now other syntax forms, variable syntax forms, behave in the case of let and cons. So when you define now a variable inside of a function or a global scope, right, and they have the same name as the let or cons, you won't be, it will throw you now an error. All right, a syntax errors it's supposed to throw you. Yep, it must throw you a syntax error. So for example, here you have a function here, you say, hey, this is now greetings, right? Greeting. In here define here the salute. Q. Q mijo. And then you let it on define a salute with the same identifier. Of course, it's gonna throw you now an error at this particular level scope, right? So you say, hey, hello, and when you call that function, right? As in, oh, of course, it's gonna throw you now a syntax error, aka it's going to now evaluate this code first before it going to call it. So in any case, well, is doing something like this. Greeting, and this is it, right? So so this is how this var, let, and cons behave when they are in the same global scope. All right. But what happened when you have now defined is a nested scope? So for example, a function, well, again, is going to be enclosing that without any issue. For example, like this, and say is Spanish, you say English, right? And here you just want is to now is, well, define this as expected. Let me actually put it here as it is. You got it, so it is much more clear of what's going on. And also is putting in this way. All right. So by the time that we now is called greeting, what do you think it'll happen? Well, first thing first is going to figuring out if that identifier, what is this identifier? Okay, if this, because this identifier is now a function declaration, is going to host that at the top of the global scope in this case, and then assign that to this value here. So once that is done, it's going to now execute, and once this happens, is the evaluation of this identifier also happens. So here it's a, hey, I'm going to now is evaluate this identifier. So is this, it is like having a conversation between the scope manager and the compiler initially, only to resolve the identifier. Hey, I do have this identifier, let me actually record that. We have another identifier, English. What is this? Well, this is part of the function declaration. So okay, let me now host it that for you, and assign that to this value, as you can see here. So by the time that we call this, and we try to print now salute, what it'll print here? Well, it's pretty obvious. So what will print here and then here, right? That's a very good question. So because now the let is scoping, because now let is a block scope, not a function scope, right? You can define this as it is. So by the time that you call now English, because at that moment the enclosing scope of functions is per variables, not per let, all right, or cons. So the value here is will be now salute of Cubo, right? And then is when now the salute is defining in this particular scope, aka shadowing. So you can now actually print this as salute. So when you do this, it's a kind of this is quite interesting here. And this is very, very interesting here. And it's actually matched the intuition. So the intuition here is that anytime that you use any particular scope, whether it's a function or a block, right? What happens is that those identifiers, right? In this case, this identifier here, those identifiers in this context, because anytime that it find now a let or cons, it automatically now going to reserve those names to that. So it's going to, this is interesting because it say this particular function scope, all right, it's saying that here by the time that I'm trying to have access a reference before the declaration or the statement, what will be the value here? This is known as the temporal zone, or the TDC, temporal dead zone, because it's actually telling you, hey, I cannot have access to salute before initialization. And this is part of this error that say, hey, because salute, I'm using is this let keyword, is a variable that is hoisted but not assigned to any values, because let and cons are also hoisted, right? Because they can, in the way to do that is because of this particular error, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be now throw this error. You just access to this salute as it is, right? So for example, if I say now this, if I now encapsulate now in a block here, then actually it's going to work as expected. I'll be right back. And we're back. That's interesting. That's actually clarify my thinking about this. Is that in any particular scope, when you define now an identifier with this syntax form, it's gonna be hosted. All right, as you can see here, it's gonna be hosted, and it is called temporal dead zone because it happens is at when the function is executed. In other words, is when is the time that happens here. So here successfully now create now is a function scope, that this function scope has a reference, outer reference to the greeting scope, and all of its identifiers, which is, in this case, salute. So of course it now prints salute here. But because we use now this block scope, and if we use now a function and so on and so forth, it will now is those identifier hoisted, all right? And in the case of let and cons, they're not gonna set to any value. And if you try to have access to them before the statement, it will throw you at reference errors like this. So why am I mentioning this about how these variables or these syntax forms behave in functions, in block, in also for loops or iteration syntax like while it actually matched the expected behavior, also the for in, for off, right? But not with the for, with traditional for, which what happened is that any time that you use now is, for example, a var, since var are block or top level global scope, this is what happened when you trying to now is use, for example, a set timeout, or trying to use the index as a way to do that. So let and count solve this particular problem, particularly let, because with counts you cannot redeclare those variables. So, and also, well, I also mentioned here is the temporal sum, like this, and so on and so forth. But also is another is why do we care about knowing these little details of the var and let and counts and how they behave in the scope, whether it's a function or a block? And it's because now as we progress or as we understand that scope in scopes in hoisting or scope, working with scope is only part of the story. Working with variables is another part of the story. So as we now starting to understand our programs in ways of how can we now write them based on the decisions. In other words, how can we write these programs not only to work the what is expected, but also for decision making? It's like, why do we even write in this program in itself? And why and how can we now make these programs robust, secure, easily to coordinate among them? And that's open up a a huge discussion here, which is as they mentioned here. So far has been explaining the mechanism of how scope and variables work, right? So with that foundation of firmly in place, our attentions rise to a higher level of thinking, all right, which is the decision and the patterns we apply in our programs, well, across the whole programs. This is when it started to well, this is the engineering mindset at the end of the day, right? The decision and patterns we apply across the whole program. So to begin, so we're going to look at how and why we should be using different level of a scope, okay? And to organize our programs variables specifically to reduce scope overexposure. And you might wonder is because now we understand is the scopes and variables and how they works, uh, and also we're going to look now from a high level perspective of how can we make our programs work as a whole, right? So what are the decisions and the patterns that we apply across our program as a whole? Decisions like what and patterns like what, you might wonder, right? Well, so when we organize our code in a way that we only expose the variables that it needs to, it is important to understand that, because this is part of the security aspect of your application, right? As well as the ability to easily iterate through that app, uh, and also in yeah, the ability to iterate through that. Okay. um mhm. The ability to iterate through that, um, and understand why we need to focus our attention on this kind of thinking, right? uh, that this is one of the reasons why this book is not for juniors or people that just have like 6 months in the language. No, no, this is for people that actually at least have a year working in complex code bases, large code bases, to starting to see why do we even care about this particularly patterns or the decision that we need to do in your code as a whole. All right, and one of them. So to begin, we're going to look at how and why we should be using different level of scope functions to organize our programs variables to reduce scope overexposure. That's interesting. Okay. So the decision and the patterns here, when it comes to now look at our programs, okay, and what are the decisions? Mm-hmm. So what are the decisions and the patterns we apply across our programs as we starting to develop more features, enhance the code base and its functionality, or remove some old previous legacy functionality, or fix some code. Okay. So the first decision we're gonna begin is uh, why we should avoid why we using different level of scope like functions and block to organize our programs variables specifically to reduce scope overexposure. Mm-hmm. And then we look at the using closure as well. Up to this point, we focus the ins and outs of lexical scope and how affect that co-organization and usage of variables in our programs. Our attention again shift broader in abstractions to the historical somewhat daunting topic of closure. And don't worry, you don't need to an advanced computer science degree to make sense of it. Our broad goal is in this book is not to merely to understand a scope, but to more effectively use it in the structure of our programs. Closure is central to that effort. So recall the main conclusion of chapter 6. The least exposure principle encourages us to use block and function scope to limiting the scope exposure of variables, and that is because you can eliminate an entire classes of bugs. So for example is name collisions, and the other is unexpected behaviors. So for some reason, if you're assuming that a variable that you're receiving is from a certain type, let's say an array of numbers, and then that some developer now passes an array of strings or booleans, so it's going to now unspec weirdly. All right. And the other is that the more property you expose, the unintended consequence of dependency, or the unintended consequence of exposing this function is that whoever is going to use that, it might now is use some of these private methods that you're exposing, all right? And therefore, or all of these unnecessary details in your application, right? All of the unnecessary or hidden properties or functionality, that if you do that, so first you're exposing yourself to some ill intent or perhaps not that developer that might misuse your variables. Interesting. Holy fuck. Misuse your variables. And the other is it'll be very hard for you to do a refactor if of that. For example, is removing some variable for that without breaking the code. So what you can do is just generate a new version of it. All right. Or provide now a polyfill to that. Okay. And here, again, we're looking is at this. So recall the main conclusion of chapter 6. The least exposure principle encourages us to use block and function scoping to the limit of a scope exposure of variables. And this help keeps code understandable and maintainable, and helps avoid many scoping pitfalls like name collision and all the other things that I mentioned before. So closures build on this approach. For variables, for variables we need to use over time. Okay. For variables we need to use over time. Unlike the principle of least exposure is to say it is better for us to organize our code for maintainability and security by exposing the least amount of variables. Okay, again, we are thinking is now high level. This is the high level thinking. So base now is on how our programs, how we design our programs. So for variables we need to use over time, and instead of placing them in larger outer scope like this, so instead of placing them in larger outer scope, okay, so for variables that we need to use over time, instead of placing them in larger outer scope, we can encapsulate more narrowly scope, then but still preserve access from inside functions for broader use. Functions remember these references scope variables via closure. But again, any variable that you want to use over time, you need to use over time, any variables, and for variables you can say any primitive or any functionality function. So any value that you need to use over time. So instead of placing them in larger outer scope, we can encapsulate more narrowly scope, then so we can encapsulate them but still preserve access from inside function for broader use. So we already saw an example of this kind of closure in the previous chapters, known as factorial, in chapter 6. Exactly. When here in the factorial we create now is a closure and a memoization as well. And you have almost certainly already using your own programs. If you ever reading a callback that access variable outside of its own scope, guess what? That's a closure. Closure is one of the most important language characteristic ever invented in programming. It underlies major. Exactly. It encapsulates major but it encapsulates here. Yes. So you have closure is one of the most important language features, language characteristic ever invented in a programming. It underlies major programming paradigms, including functional programming, models, and even a bit of class-oriented design. Getting comfortable with closure is required for mastering JavaScript and effectively leveraging many important design patterns throughout your code. Addressing all aspects of closures require a daunting mountain of discussion and code throughout this chapter. Okay. Addressing all aspects of closure require a daunting mountain, a daunting mountain of discussion and code throughout this chapter. So make sure to take your time and ensure you're comfortable with each bit of that. And the other is in chapter 8, right? Which is the model pattern. So in this chapter, we'll wrap up the main text of the book by exploring one and the most important co-organization patterns in all programming, the model. As we'll see, models are inherently built from what we have already covered, the payoff for your efforts in learning lexical scope and closures. We have examined every angle of lexical scope from breadth of the global scope down through the nested global scope into the intricacies of variables like cycles. Then we leverage lexical scope to understand the full power of closures. Take a moment to reflect on how far you have come in this journey so far. You have taken big steps in getting to know JavaScript more deeply. The central theme of this book has been that understanding and mastering a scope and closure is key in properly structuring and organizing our code, especially the decisions on where to store information in variables. The central theme of this book has been that understanding and mastering the scope and closure is key in properly structuring and organizing our code, especially the decisions of where to store information in variables. So our goal in this final chapter is to appreciate how models embody the importance of these topics, elevating them from abstract concepts to concrete, practical improvement in building programs. Okay. But I do want us to read about is this. Okay, so okay. Holy moly. So is this is we have looked so far is scope, we have looked so far is scope, the lexical scope, the scope change. Now I do get it. The scope change. Exactly, the scope change. Um, the scope and the scope change. The scope change, the different type of scopes, whether it's function, block, and global scope, where this global scope live, and how the variables works across different scope, right? The life cycle of variables across different scopes. Holy moly. All right, and then here is two. Um, all right, and then here on chapter 6, 7, and 8 is describing now is the high level high is to bring our attention to this high level thinking, which is the decision and patterns the decision and patterns the decision and patterns we applied to our the decision and patterns we apply to our program as a whole. All right, and that is, so let's going to start with the least exposure. Makes a lot of sense. So let's start with the least exposure. Why do we even care about that in terms of security and maintainability of your code? And then the closures. So if you need to work with a variable over time, okay. If you need to work with a variable, okay. If you need to work with a variable over time, aka preserving that, so closure is a feature of the language from the functional programming. Okay. And the other, holy hell. Okay. And the other, okay, the other is the models. Is that now that we know the reason of this the least exposure, okay, now that we know is why we need to use this principle of least exposure, and why do we even care about closures as a way to now organize features that we need to use over time. Okay. Then we look now at how can we organize all of that into models. Holy hell. Oh crap. And the next model or the next book is the objects in classes. Lighting web security at Salesforce. Rick Waldron. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. I know that I'm jumping couple stuff here. Oh my god. Damn, bitch, you live like this? Oh man, this is too real. Oh man. Damn, bitch, you live like this. Cancer Diaries. Stage 4, colorectal cancer. Mhm. Mhm. Okay. Mhm. Massachusetts, Boston. Idiomatic GS. Principle of writing consisting idiomatic JavaScript. Matthias Bang is here? God damn, son. This is a living document, and new ideas for improving the code around us are always welcome. Contribute for clone, branch, commit, push, and pull requests. All code in any code base should look like a single person typing it, no matter how many people contributed. All great good code. The following list outlines the practice that I have used in all code that I am the original author of. Contributions to projects that I have created should follow these guidelines. I do not intend to impose my self-preference on other people's codes or projects. If any existing common style exists, it should be respected. Arguments over styles are pointless. There should be a style guide, and you should follow it. Rebecca Murphy. Part of being a good steward to a successful project is realizing that writing code for yourself is a bad idea. TM. If thousands of people are using your code, then write your code for maximum clarity, not for your personal preference of how to get clever within the spec. Code quality tools, resource and reference, Sonar, Plateau, GSPerf, Fiddle, GoPen, SonarQ. Yeah, because at the end of the day, is that get smart. ECMAScript language specification. Yeah, I am quite familiar with Sonar, code quality and security. Idiomatic style manifesto, white space. Oh, okay. Consistency always wins. Practical style. A practical model. And then you attach that. A practical constructor. How old is this? jQuery proxy. Dojo hinge. How old is this? Comma first. Don't do stupid shit and everything will be okay. To reinform this concept, please watch the following presentation. Everything is permitted. Extending built-ins. By Andrew Dupont, GSConf, Portland, Oregon. The basic principle here are native and host objects. And comments. Single line above the code that is subject. Multi-line is good. End of the line comments are prohibited. GS doc style is good, but requires significant time investment. Programs should be written in one language, whatever the language may be, as dictated by the maintainer or maintainers.
This talk draws inspiration from two sources.
Andrew Dupont.
The first is something this guy said. Who is this guy? Yell it out. That's correct. Alex Russell wrote this in a blog post a few months ago about feature detection and UA sniffing and all the stuff that he's presumably talking about tomorrow. And he closed out the post with this. And I knew exactly what he was talking about because I see examples of
There's a whole lot of nothing advocacy that's still happening in the GS web design world these days, and it annoys me, annoys me to no end. I am not sure how our community got so religious and fact disorientated, but it has but it has got to stop.
moralized black and white thinking in the JavaScript community all the time. I see it not so much in conferences like these, but I see it on Stack Overflow and in blog comments and on Usenet, although I suppose that's what Usenet is for. But it worries me because ordinarily developers realize that best practices are highly situational, and that what works for someone who's writing a Node app may not work for someone who's on the client-side team at Facebook, and may not work for the guy who's maintaining isabevagodaalive.com. And in fact, we see that same nuance in other fields. I've read several introductory books that
If you use this book as a guide, by all means leave the road when you wish. That is precisely the use of a road, to reach individually chosen points of departure. By all means break the rules and break them beautifully, deliberately as well. This is one of the ends for which they exist.
for several diverse topics that have this idea that there are rules and you should follow them at first, but over time, you sort of learn the purpose of the rule in the first place, and then you can break the rules if you want. That they sort of become guidelines as you get wiser. George Orwell understood it too. He
Break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous.
realized that he couldn't write a catch-all set of guidelines for using something as complicated as the English language. So he made sure that the reader knew that the rules were less important than the ideas behind them. And that's why I'm worried
This is the post-Truber.
complicated as the English language. So he made sure that the reader knew that the rules were less important than the ideas behind them. And that's why I'm worried when I hear people reciting commandments. we shouldn't treat coding practices like morality. And we should be precise in our tutorials and in our evangelism in order to discourage that kind of black and white thinking. The other inspiration was this guy. Who is this guy? Say it louder. It is Donald Glover. And he tweeted this last year.
Shorts are dope. Just wear them right, not mid-leg, like you are a fucking Creed concert. Mid-leg? What the hell? Mid-leg. Mid-leg is what I think it is?
And aside from being excellent advice in its own right, I think this is a great way to frame a contrarian argument, because you can attack any rule in this manner, and you're probably right. So let's treat this as my thesis. Metaphorically, I'm going to mount a defense of shorts, but I'm not saying we should all wear shorts all the time. In fact, some of us should never wear shorts ever at all. So I suppose I'm saying that some of us should maybe wear shorts more often. This is the sub-thesis of my talk, that code can be regulated not through rules enforced by language design or by morality, but by the evolution of social customs. And so we should be less concerned about what is right and wrong in best practices than about what is polite and impolite. I think that's a far better way to talk about these things, because politeness has greater situational awareness than morality does. Morality doesn't make many exceptions for context. Like, you can kill a guy if he's trying to kill you, but really, but that's about it. And, but as far as politeness, people understand that it depends greatly on context, as is the case with best practices. So I want to approach the topic of extending built-ins from that angle, and sort of look at the past, the present, and the future of it. Prototype has been extending built-ins for years. So let's go back to the beginning and see where its ideas came from. It started out as a tiny collection of convenience functions. Version 1.0 of Prototype was 104 lines of code, of a size that you probably wouldn't even bother putting on GitHub these days. Version 1.1 was the first version to feature an interesting piece of code that extends object.prototype. It does so for an arguably useful reason. It's nice to be able to merge two objects together, but it has a pretty big downside. I've just defined an enumerable property on all my objects. So that means our annoying or helpful method shows up in all for-in loops. So there are ways around this. You can use hasOwnProperty to check whether the property belongs to the object itself or to its prototype. And this is Crockford arguing for this very thing. Raise your hand if you write all your for loops like this. Don't lie, you're all on GitHub, I can check. All right. So nobody listened, or very few people listened. 5 trolls in the back listened, apparently. So there was no chance of this happening. And I know because Crockford told us to do it, and we didn't do it. For one thing, Safari 2.0 and below didn't support hasOwnProperty, and that was important at the time. But also, this is a major chore, and you've got to do it every single time you write a for-in loop. And it's hard to convince people to opt into a chore. It's easier to dictate what people shouldn't do than what they should. Eric Arvidsson, now of Google and a contributor to ECMAScript, suggested a different approach back in 2005. He said we should just agree to be hands-off with object.prototype. And this was easier to enforce because there are far fewer people who want to extend object.prototype than there are people who want to use for-in loops. So this is what the community ended up doing instead. But I find this fascinating. This is how he starts off the post. It is not seldom that you see people messing with object.prototype. it was apparently not seldom that in mid-2005, people were doing this sort of thing. So I imagine the prototype wasn't the only offender. And then one of the comments to the post explains that no, it's totally okay to add whatever you want to object.prototype. You just have to use has_own_property, and then you have to implement it in browsers that don't support it. So if you want to add n methods to object.prototype, you just have to add n+1, and you're totally fine. And it's revealing, because the comment assumes that you write all the code. And I'm sure that was true for the commenter, but we were very quickly moving toward a model where most of the code that runs on a page wasn't written by the page's owner. And the fact that we were having this conversation in the first place shows that this was sort of already upon us, because we don't need to have conversations about manners if we're all hermits. So between 1.3 and 1.4, prototype changed. It moved object.prototype.extend to object.extend. If legend is to be believed, this was largely the work of Dean Edwards. As it was told to me, Dean emailed Sam Stevenson one day and said, so I'm going to write a blog post recommending against using prototype because it extends object.prototype. I really like prototype, and I really don't want to have to do that, so instead I hope you'll just change prototype. And Sam did, and I think it was a good move. I think both Dean and Sam did the right thing there. And as a result, that was the first and last time that prototype ever touched object.prototype. Of course, prototype has extended other built-in objects since the beginning. For a while, the only method added to arrays, though, was push, and only in environments where it didn't exist, like Internet Explorer 5. But prototype 1.4 had enumerable, which had a lot of methods for iterating over arrays. So in version 1.4, prototype went from adding nothing to array.prototype, except in Explorer 5, to adding around 30 methods. And that broke some code in the wild. And there are a couple of odd legitimate use cases for doing for-in on arrays. People have argued for sparse arrays and using for-in on those so that you don't have to loop through a bunch of undefined properties. But most for-in usage in the wild was just dumb. And most people were treating arrays like hashes when they could just as easily have used objects. And so I said so 5 years ago, I think. I said that using arrays as hashes is no more reasonable than using string objects or regular expression objects or anything else as a hash. And it became the most popular thing I've ever written. So I wasn't even a prototype developer back then. But buried in this article is the idea that prototype may not be for everyone. If someone had said to me, I'd love to use prototype, but I've got dumb third-party code on my page that does for-in over arrays, and I can't replace it, and I can't change it, I would have said, that sucks. You should probably use another framework. Prototype was never trying to conquer the world. It was happy to be a love it or hate it kind of thing. There's one more area to cover quickly. In 1.5, we started adding things to DOM nodes. In general, it made working with DOM far less painful, but it pushed prototype into a minefield, though we may not have realized it at the time. We could extend elements cheaply in most browsers with our convenience methods, but not in IE because you weren't able to augment DOM objects prototypes until version 8. So in Explorer, we had to copy them over manually one by one as elements were retrieved. And we tried to optimize this as much as possible, but it was still a huge performance bottleneck. And it was a millstone around our necks in the selector engine wars. We ran into other problems too. Over time, it became clearer and clearer that host objects behave in unpredictable ways and weren't converging on any sort of common behavior. And it's because host objects, by definition, don't have to abide by any rules. And so we were stuck with this approach for backward compatibility, but we decided that Prototype 2.0 would have wrappers around DOM nodes and event objects instead of augmenting them directly. A year ago, Cangax wrote the definitive article about this sort of thing. And I agree with just about everything he says in this article. And I would even agree that this was the biggest mistake prototype ever made. But if I may segue out of prototype and into general best practices, Nicholas Zakis' article about not modifying objects you don't own, I think, is also relevant. And I see it referenced all over the place, and I have no quarrel with the basic arguments. But let's apply this to built-ins. Don't modify objects you don't own. All right, who owns built-ins? We might say that the language owns built-ins, but then they're not the most diligent of caretakers. There are things that we've needed for ages, like trim on strings or like collection methods on arrays that got added very slowly over time because the process of specification is necessarily slow. And when I say I shouldn't modify that object because I don't own it, I'm saying it's not my job to modify it, it's someone else's job. And so if something's not working right in a third-party library I'm using, I could monkey patch it to work the way I want, but I should probably just file a bug with the library maintainer because it's their job to fix it. But nobody claims to provide this level of service for built-ins. I think we all own built-ins. I think they're shared property. And as a result, they have all the upsides and downsides of shared property. It's mine to use, and I'm trusted to use it in a way that doesn't mess it up for other people. So rules regarding shared property are just as much about courtesy as they are about law. So we come back to this idea of social customs in code, relying not on the language's rules for what is allowed, but on guidelines that we develop ourselves over time and through negotiation. And this is just like real life, where we have roads and sidewalks and parks that we all pay for and we all get to use. And in public, there are many, many bastardly things that you can do, but you don't because you don't want to be a dick. And most of us are sensitive to that and to the community's agreed upon standards of politeness. And we already have this in JavaScript. This is how we decided that object.prototype was, that we were going to treat it as a DMZ. And we've got people like Doug Crockford who writes Emily Post-like lists of do's and don'ts. And we've got people like John Resig who, rather than write it down, further their ideas of politeness through the code they write. And it's all great. And it's not the sort of thing, oops. Where's my pointer? There we are. We shouldn't run from this sort of thing because it's a powerful force and it makes the language better. This doesn't happen in Java, where the language itself outlaws anything that anyone might consider rude. And in that sense, it's a lot like Singapore. But JavaScript is a lot less authoritarian and more, as a result, more adaptive to evolving customs. I know all this because I've seen it happen in the Ruby community. Because Ruby has evolved quite a bit in the last 7 years because of the influence of Rails. And because nearly everything is possible in Ruby itself, the language has evolved primarily through the influence of community norms. There are some of us who think that taking ideas from other languages is wrong somehow, that it shows you're stuck in a non-JavaScript mindset. I don't really buy into that because Ruby and JavaScript are remarkably similar. They share a Smalltalk influence. JavaScript took a detour through Self, which is the Smalltalk offshoot that introduced the idea of prototypal inheritance. But their design ideas are otherwise very much in agreement. From the beginning, Rails took full advantage of Ruby's dynamism. Rails is basically a collection of dependencies, and one of them is called active support, and it holds all of Rails' extensions to Ruby's standard library. And it's got stuff like this. So because you can add stuff to the numeric class, that's sort of the superclass of both integers and floats, you can have a terse expressive syntax for describing time spans and dates in the future or the past, or for describing quantities of bytes or megabytes. And I find that most people, when they see this, think either, holy shit, that's awesome, I would use that all the time, or holy shit, that's ridiculous, please never show that to me again. This is a less polarizing example. So if you need to iterate over a collection and call an instance method on each item, you can do it the first way in Ruby, which is sort of the explicit way of defining a block, which is basically a function. Or you can do it the second way, because active support defines a coercion rule for converting a symbol into a function, much the same way that there are implicit conversions, implicit coercions in JavaScript, like toString and value of. And so active support defined one of those coercion rules for symbols where one didn't exist before. So this didn't break anything, and was a really sort of concise way to describe something that people needed to do very often. And so this was widely regarded in the Ruby community as a good idea, so much so that it's actually now in the language itself. And all the major Ruby engines implement it natively. And it reminded me of something that happened in JavaScript. Way back in 2004, a Swedish programmer named Daniel Brockman wrote a white paper about partial application in JavaScript and ways to rebind scope. And the paper takes us through several iterations, but we eventually end up with this. And as far as I know, this was the first appearance of function.prototype.bind in the wild. And apparently Sam Stevenson stumbled upon it sometime later, because bind has been in prototype since the very first version. And if we look at the old Prototype 1.0 website, we see Daniel's name in the list of contributors. At first, bind only rebounds scope. That's all it did, both as defined in Daniel's white paper and as implemented in Prototype. But by Prototype 1.4, it was rewritten to support partial
rebound
bind in the wild. And apparently Sam Stevenson stumbled upon it sometime later, because bind has been in Prototype since the very first version. And if we look at the old Prototype 1.0 website, we see Daniel's name in the list of contributors. At first, bind only rebounds scope. That's all it did.
Rebound. Of securing possession of rebounding basket after missing shot. In Spanish, how do you say that? Rebound. Un rebote. Yeah, that's right. So bind, what it's doing is rebound the scope. Rebound the scope.
Did. But
Exactly, it's rebound the scope here. To say, hey, when you call me here, I'm gonna have access to the this, as well as the args, as well as the objects. And what I want to is to apply that methods here that'll be part of the function value when you call me, that I'm going to apply now to this new object, alright, followed by the arguments here.
both as defined in Daniel's white paper and as implemented in Prototype. But by Prototype 1.4, it was rewritten to support partial application by passing extra arguments to the original function, much like you would do with call. So think about that and the fact that specs don't always get it right the first time. We saw that with call and apply. Call was great, but it failed to address the case where you need to pass some arguments along, but you might not know exactly how many of them there are. So we needed to apply for that case. And
So call, and this is interesting. So call is something. So call is great because you can pass now arguments to this. But what happens when you don't know the length of that? That's why we have now apply to.
So now bind is in the ES5 spec, and it's certainly the case that the spec probably would have gotten around to implementing bind, even without its widespread use. It's not like this was an idea that nobody would have thought of. But I wonder if they would have gotten it right the first time. Or would it have looked like Daniel's first version? The fact that we can define it and use it in real-world code also lets us see what we might change about it. And that's a proving ground for APIs that specs can't really compete with. For me, that's the greatest value of grassroots improvements to the language. But back to Ruby. So I gave you two examples of active support enhancements. One of them is hugely popular and the other is still divisive. The drawback of social customs in code is the occasional act of rudeness. People will write stupid code, as they always do, but their stupid code will sometimes get in your way, and vice versa. Zed Shaw is an infamous ex-Rubyist. He's primarily known for writing code and yelling at people. And he's very good at both, and sometimes they run in parallel. And he's able to deliver impassioned rants about good and bad code. And once he had a terrible time debugging an issue that turned out to be caused by someone else's.
Set Sean. Who the French are you? Canadian software developer. Okay. Trillionaire beggars. Sometimes it is fun to die. Oh, okay, this is part of their stories. Okay. Programmers are fascist prick. Even a bad day painting is better than any day working. Damn, son. Okay. In 2017. They confuse their acquisition of Along with being real super dudes. Libertines of San Francisco to skip a couple Burning Man urges. Has a huge problem with corruption and graft. More than any other city that I have lived in. This constant fight between the wannabe libertines just trying to get whipped at a citadel and the programmers living off suck scraps ends up ruining what could be a fantastic place to live. San Francisco will always be a bittersweet place for me in my life. On the one hand, my books took off there and I was able to start a new career doing something I really enjoy. I also learned to paint, which I will always cherish for the rest of my life. I love some woman so deeply it still makes me sad that they didn't work out in the end. San Francisco was also where I had the most terrible heartbreak of my life, where I saw the most violence and government indifference I have ever seen, where I encountered a group of people who abuse and fed off their peers for tiny scrap or small points on worthless startups. And another group who attacks their fellow denizens for simply having a job. My fondest memory of San Francisco will be sunny days and spent at Union Square, playing guitar, made a talking to random, wonderful, weird regulars, Union Square healed the hands broken by terrible NGC teacher and his improved scale. Without the warm sunshine and the open place to just do scales 4 hours, I would have given up on guitar entirely. Not many hand strings all fixed, so I also remember that I first learned to draw at Fort Mason. I mean, I think that's right, but that's close enough for the memory. I remember sitting there looking at the dogs, drawing scenes, feeling that blissful peace I have when I paint or draw now, listening to my lover hum and draw along with me. It'll be always be a permanent loving memory. Okay. I also miss all the incredible museums in our school. I own the Legion of Honor, the Dijon, the SV MoMA, and the FAI. So much for teaching me about art for all the time period. If you live there and you aren't going to the museum on a regular basis, you're truly missing out one of the gems of the US museum world. If you can also pop a flight down to LA and visit Getty, you definitely should. The Getty is a work of art in its own. I probably went there 20 times for a whole day just because. New York is that lover I sometimes check out to see if she is doing alright. She was actually cool and way out of my league. I just wasn't cool enough for her at the time. San Francisco will always be the lover who made me feel awesome and successful while cheating on me and calling me a fat nerd. Those places are all over for me now, except for the occasional visit. Goodbye, it was fun, almost. I mean, yeah, but I know. Why Miami? The first reason I simply was the time for a change. I actually wanted to live a few years ago, but things always kept me there. Relationship, art, school, work, or just too many gators. I didn't want to ship my time. My time in San Francisco was very lonely, and my only social interaction were with the women I dated. So it ended up that relationship means a lot to me, even if they were flawed and doomed to fail. Once there was a break in this pattern, I was able to finally plan a move. The second reason is have a goal of living and studying art overseas in the next few years. There is one tiny wrinkle in this. California is ruthless about collecting taxes from people who live overseas. Everyone I talk to say definitely moved to a state without income taxes. This is what the truth of all of this matter. The taxes, bro. Before you move overseas or California will grab your bank account without any warning. At these regions in most states without income taxes are freezing cool or fairly lame. Florida wasn't that appealing, but Miami seems really great when I visited. Clean, modern, everyone is really generally happy, great weather, and easy to live here. I don't even need a car here. That's great. I'm also looking to improve my landscape painting, marine painting, and art. The final reason is I want a place that I wasn't so pissed off and depressed all the time. I tell people when I live in the city, you can sort of feel a personality permeating everything. The personality of New York was a bipolar car jester. They were days you could tell and you see was pissed off at you. Other days where Gotham loved you like a monster. And most of the time it was fucking hilarious. San Francisco personality is definitely that of a depressed but brilliant failed artist. It was always sad that I wasn't considered a greater city and jealous everyone overlooked it good quality. So it took that out of everyone living there. I guess in many ways I kind of adopted the personality of a city while I lived there. I don't know what Miami is like yet, but I'm still getting the sense that Miami actually doesn't give a fuck what I think about her. Miami is looking too fabulous to care. Okay. This is in 2017. Okay. Okay. Photographing art. The Billionaires versus Brandon M. The eagle doesn't hunt flies. But this is the opinion here. Don't let the haters. What is this? Don't let the haters get you down. The billionaires versus Brandon meme. Recently, Dropbox became one of the largest companies to be worth billions of dollars without turning a profit. A Drew Houston became a billionaire. And Drew Houston became a billionaire. I worked for Drew for a bit and decided that he was not the leader for me. If you like to see why, take a look at this. What's the post he's referring to? Why it is an 11-year-old post? Brandon M. was from a 22-year-old undergrad student who is now a 33-year-old man and most likely a regular old working stiff. Brandon M is not a billionaire, while Drew most definitely is one. Brandon M has absolutely zero power in this situation, and Drew has an infinite amount more by comparison. Additionally, what Brandon M said does not deserve this level of retribution. Well, any case. Okay, the beggar barons. When you think of the word robber, what comes to your mind? Do you imagine here? No, of course not. You imagine someone low class, poor, desperate, or crazy. Money so bad they are willing to risk getting killed robbing another person. I associate the word robber with billionaires because the wealthy have had millennia to cement the association of wealth. If a 10th century king invaded a city and ransacked it, we have called him a conqueror, even though he's actually just robbing the city. John D. Rockefeller devised an ingenious plan for Standard Oil. He had Standard Oil open gas stations in towns with competition at a significant loss. He was worth billions of dollars, so Standard Oil could easily eat the losses. This lower price would bankrupt the local competitor because they couldn't lower their prices and survive. After all of the competition was wiped out, Standard Oil will buy out the dead competitor, turning into Standard Oil Station, and then raise the price far beyond the real market price because Standard Oil now had a monopoly in that area. Rockefeller didn't make his money through innovation. He didn't invent gasoline, car, natural gas processing methods, shipping, or anything else that would justify his wealth. Rockefeller basically stole his wealth through unfair business practice designed to gouge consumers, robbing them through economic force, and he was a robber baron. At a late 18th century businessman who used monopoly, did politic bribes, and unscrupulous practice to rob the unfortunate of their money. We eventually passed a law to outlaw this practice, namely the Sherman Antitrust Act, which outlaws every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade. At the time, these robbers Barron proclaimed that they were just better at business than everyone else, and they were justified in earning the money. They didn't steal from anyone. They sold superior products. They were genius. Obviously, they weren't genius or sold better products, but they have to maintain the facade to hide the rubber power of rubber baron. If they admit they were thieves, then everyone will have revolted sooner. Instead, the robber barons put forward this visage of being industrialists, men of great actions and ideas, carving a path through the world using industry. Baron von Apple, Marqués dos Microsoft. Wait, what? Microsoft is worth trillions of dollars. Why are they begging me to write docs for them? That's actually my real profession. Why would I work for a trillionaire for free? What in the hell is going on? Well, feel free to submit a pull request. This also isn't the only time I have seen Microsoft employees beg for free works. They have become masters of pretending to be woke fighter for socialist ideals through open source, but seemingly only as a means of begging for free labor from others. Microsoft having trillions of dollars should mean they never ask someone to work on their product without compensation. Instead, what we get is, oh please, mister, won't you please just spare a little of your time rewriting our documentation? We are only poor trillionaires with nothing to our names but our trillions-dollar business. Won't you think of the starving trillionaire? I believe we're in the era of beggar barons. Just like the robber barons before, there are fabulous wealthy companies that build their empires by directly or indirectly begging for free labor from open source developers. The beggar barons aren't stealing this labor though. They're just using unscrupulous business practice and social manipulation to beg for free labor. Robbing will be more what Amazon does when it outright steals open source without crediting the author. Or straight up just steal Elasticsearch trademark. Now, this beginning is particularly different because it capitalized on the goodwill of open source developers. Microsoft, Apple, and Google are standing on the internet in their trillion-dollar business suit with a sign that reads starving and homeless. Any free labor will help. They aren't holding people at the gun point. Rather, they hold out their Rolex and cross their hand and beg, bled, and shame open source developers until they get free labor. Once they get these free labors, they rarely give credit. They are ungrateful beggars that takes their donations, work hours, jump in their Tesla, and ride off to make more trillions proclaiming, haha, the open source idiot just gave me 10 hours of free labor. What a loser. Barons of Microsoft upon ads. I get a call from a friend who works at Microsoft saying his manager is really keen on hiring me. I found that out since usually programmers have to beg for their jobs, but I'm curious, so I take the interview. His manager first time with me, and we start talking about how I could work on Azure as an engineer, but he keep asking me about learn Python the hard way. Learn Python the hard way.org. So how much traffic does this site get a month? I'm kind of puzzled, but tell him. His eyes sparkle at the numbers. How did you make the site? It is your own code? I'll tell him it is my own code. Then I ask him, why is he asking me about my website? Oh, I just thinking about how we can put ads on it. I am floored. What do you mean? Put ads on it? Yeah, after you start working here, we'll want to put ads on learnpythonthehardway.org to monetize it. Yes, you read that right. Microsoft thought that hiring me as an employee magically transferred all of my copyrighted material and existing. Mhm. Mhm. Ah, okay. Interesting. Mhm. Model JavaScript intermediate constant. The models are import. Mm. Mhm. Mhm. But their innovation is a rebranded copy of some poor soccer hobby project where a couple thousand lines ago they just run Linux containers of etcd. They are innovators, not beggars. Really? Whole dealing in abstraction upon abstraction. So when it comes to any other topic, we easily can abstract everything to be the same as anything. To a programmer, a cat and a shark both descend from the same part of the taxonomic ranking system. They're exactly the same. Today, when I saw Microsoft begging for pull requests make them bigger barrels, they read is as any project asking for pull requests is exactly the same as a company worth any project asking for pull requests is exactly the same as a company worth $2 trillion begging for pull requests. They think me saying, just spend a week implementing these 4 lines of code for us. Mm.
Dumb monkey patch.
I only reopen a class after I try everything other option like subclassing, wrapping, etc. If nothing else works or it is too much effort for the modification, then I document the hell out of my modification and try desperately to localize the change so that it doesn't hurt anyone else.
And he posted on Usenet about it because, again, that's what Usenet is for.
The change.
He writes, not only does this code reopen a class to do something that could just as easily be done with subclassing, but the author also turns off documentation so that nobody knows about it. So much for principle of least surprise. This is more like principle of most heinous arsenic injection. Please think of the children before you reopen their parent with a damn chainsaw. The web is awesome because it assigns ideas permalinks. And I can't tell you how often people answer Ruby questions in news groups and on Stack Overflow and on forums by linking to the chainsaw infanticide logger maneuver. It's one of the major contributors to Ruby's current community standards of polite core extensions and polite monkey patching. I'm partial to a similar fable on rubyforum.com. Someone had asked about doing something self-consciously clever with a constructor so that a certain method would always magically get called at the end of initialization. And someone wrote, that may look good now, but someone who's debugging some code which depends on it will hate you. And when you're debugging 6 months from now, you'll hate yourself. If you really want to do this, put some real effort into designing a clean API for it. Make it obvious that you're putting a twist on the conventional method calling chain. Document the API so it's obvious in a coherent, readily understandable way. Don't slip a concrete dildo into someone's box of Fruit Loops. They won't be happy
Don't
with
slip a concrete dildo into someone's box of Fruit Loops. They won't be happy with your morning breakfast surprise.
your morning breakfast surprise. Put the concrete dildo in a clearly labeled box with instructions. Then when someone encounters a problem, hey, something is screwing me here, maybe it's the concrete dildo, at least they know to ask.
The Higgs boson. Okay, the concrete dildo.
Yehuda Katz is a major figure in both Ruby's community and ours, and he said something interesting recently in the comments of one of his blog posts. It's occasionally the case that a core extension in active support will conflict with a core extension in another Ruby library. And the commenter asked him why, when this happens, it's usually the other library that's expected to change. And he replied with this, and it makes sense to me. If generalized extensions to built-ins are a privilege, we can choose to grant that privilege to exactly one library in order to minimize the risk of conflict. In practice, this is what the Ruby community has done. Rather than have a bunch of libraries that try to enhance the language, they've standardized around active support in practice. And it gives us a sort of, it gives us a way to go forward in JavaScript, I think. Make mental note of all the libraries that you use on your website and count how many of them try to provide language extensions, how many of them extend built-ins. If the answer is more than one, you've probably got a problem. If the answer is exactly one, everything's fine. And if the answer is 0, then you should probably be defining some language extensions yourself or else you're putting plastic on a couch like our grandparents used to do. So Ruby has learned a few things from these fights, and they're all applicable to the JavaScript community as well. First of all, if your code extends built-ins, make it plainly obvious to anyone either reading the code or reading the documentation. It shouldn't be a surprise. Second, because active support is a collection of largely separate language enhancements, it's also useful that you can require just parts of it rather than the whole thing. And that minimizes the chance of collisions. And yes, you can monkey patch, but do so as a last resort and in a way that ensures that you won't break the method. Luckily, there's a strong testing ethos in the Ruby community. So when a library monkey patches something, it's usually got a crap load of unit tests to ensure that the method still works as expected. But as I see it, there are still two big problems left that can't be solved in modern day Ruby, and unfortunately, both of them are also applicable to JavaScript. The first is the thing that we just talked about. I can grant the privilege of extending built-ins to one library, but only one. Zacchaeus' blog post mentions Immanuel Kant's test for determining if an act is moral. What if everyone did it? Would it create chaos? And despite the fact that that frames best practices in terms of morality, I think that's a legitimate question. I find this troubling. On one hand, it's a privilege that's freely agreed upon between the privileged library and the user. There's no coercion involved or anything. But it does start me off down a path of picking and choosing my dependencies based on which core extensions they rely upon. For Prototype, this has been a problem. There are cases where Prototype has run into conflicts with other libraries that extend built-ins, most notably ext, and there's no easy way around that. And I don't want people to have to choose between Prototype and something else. The other problem is related to this. When I use Rails, it pulls in active support and all of its core extensions. Is it doing that for me, or is it doing that for Rails? Like, does Rails extend built-ins just so Rails can use those built-in extensions, or is it also stuff that it thinks that I would find useful? It's a bit of both, but the point is that once a library requires a core extension, it's out there, visible to everyone, whether they ask for it or not. So I've given the historical perspective, and now that the language is evolving, we're getting tools to deal with some of this stuff. Is there any way we can extend built-ins safely right now? Like, say we wanted to bring back object.prototype.extend in a less annoying fashion. So we couldn't write it like this. We could do something like this. ES5 now lets us define a property, set its value, and mark it as non-enumerable. So we can prevent it from showing up in for in loops. So our example from before seems to work now. Prevent it from showing up in for.
Hey, in this object, I do want to define this property that'll have this, and the value will be this. Okay. Holy hell.
And mark it as non-enumerable. So we can prevent it from showing up in for in loops. So our example from before seems to work now, only twice. Through the loop. Instead of 3 times.
And extend. Hey, is this property is there? President in White House?
We might be tempted to stop now and declare victory, but there are a couple of other problems. What if I have an object with a key called extend? I can't call my extend method on it the way I want. It's been shadowed. My property, I can't call my, there are a couple of other problems. What if I have an object with a key called extend? I can't call my extend method on it the way I want.
Because it is shadowed.
It's been shadowed. My property shadows the one on the prototype. This is the problem with having to use objects as hashes. And then there's this, which is far sneakier. anything you add to object.prototype will be added to window, or whatever your global object is. And because it's the global scope, any unqualified reference to that identifier will point to the global copy. As far as I know, there's nothing you can do about this either. This will happen even in strict mode. And as I understand it, these issues are part of the reason why all the new ES5 stuff is landing on object rather than object.prototype. If we had object.prototype.define property, we'd be creating a global define property function also. So even in ES5, there's no safe way to extend object.prototype in the general case. For other built-ins, it's not so bad because you don't have to worry about key collisions because you're not using those objects as hashes. If you're defining extensions for an ES5 only environment like Node, you should seriously think about defining all those extensions as non-enumerable. If you're defining extensions in an environment that may or may not have ES5 stuff, it's not as simple. Prototype could define all of its array extensions as non-enumerable in ES5 environments, but then we'd have a weird situation where those extensions would get enumerated in some browsers, but not in others. And I'm not sure that's progress. But speaking of ES5 only environments, Node is a homogeneous environment. You don't have to worry about that sort of thing. And it supports all of the ES5 awesomeness. So surely this is a safe place to extend built-ins. I saw that Too Tall Nate released a Node time library a few weeks back, and it's a perfect example of what I think Node should be doing with built-ins. It augments the built-in date object in JavaScript to add support for time zones. So you require the library, your date object is enhanced, and when you create a new date, it'll have methods for setting and getting the time zone. And once you set the time zone, all date methods will take the time zone into account when returning values. It's minimally invasive and highly valuable. It's adding 3 or 4 methods to dates that are highly unlikely to conflict with anything. Methods to dates that are highly unlikely to conflict with anything. There's one more browser topic, though, that we should talk about. The browser has always been an uneven landscape. And we've always had to deal with varying capabilities across browsers. And the disparity will only get broader now that we've got ES5. So why not smooth it out? Back in the day, it was common to implement array, the push method on arrays or apply on functions for browsers that didn't support them. And there seems to be widespread agreement that we should try to do this for ES5. Which is a weird sort of thing. It's sort of like the opposite of paving the cow paths. Rather than take something that everybody's doing and standardize it, we're taking something that's agreed to be standard in a feature spec and sort of like retconning it into our existing narrative.
Expect that the browser
but it's something that everybody seems to be behind.
Natively.
So here's a version of object.keys for ES3, taken directly from the Mozilla Developer Center docs, which are great because for any ES5 method that's implementable in ES3, they will have the example implementation right there on the page. Prototype already had an object.keys method, so we had to change it to conform to the spec, including throwing the type error if you give it a non-object. So it technically broke backward compatibility, but the impact of the change was minimal. Change was minimal. Likewise, here's MDC's version of bind. It's very similar in behavior to the one in ES5. It's not quite identical. There's a lot of nuanced behavior in the ES5 version that we can't quite replicate, but it's all minor stuff. To get us started on the idea of safe, sensible built-in extension, I'm proposing the least controversial idea I can think of. Let's start depending on function.prototype.bind. I would love to see this snippet of JavaScript become the world's most widely used polyfill. Let's treat it as the canonical definitive way to bind scope in JavaScript. Now, every library already has a way to bind scope, but that's kind of the problem. Every library has its own way of binding scope. I think we're talking about something that's so basic to the understanding of the language that it shouldn't be a library function. new JavaScript users struggle mightily with scope. It doesn't really help that each library has a different way of doing it. And a lot of people, I think, just throw up their hands and write var that equals this and just to be done with it. And I'm sure I'm biased, but I've seen no library function that can compete with the terseness and simplicity of bind. If I run into a scope issue, if I see that my callback isn't executing in the scope I thought it would, I can just add dot bind this to the end of the function and everything works. So that's my proposal. I think we should take that bind polyfill and make sure it's pulled into every website we make. Prototype is going to complete its ES5 conformance in the next minor version. We'll change our version of bind to match the polyfill, and we'll do the same for the rest of our collisions with built-in ES5 methods. And this is part of the contract, I think. If a method in your library ends up getting standardized somehow, make sure your version agrees with the spec and change it if it doesn't, even if it breaks backward compatibility. That way you can take advantage of the more performant native version if it's there. So we've done past and present, and so let's take a look at what the future holds. There are still a couple of large problems that prevent us from extending built-ins completely safely in JavaScript. But class boxes are a new idea in language development. And by a new idea, I mean it's about 8 years old. But that's often how long it takes to go from conception to implementation. The aim is to bridge the gap between classical module systems and environments where everything is mutable. Class boxes let me say, I want to make these changes to existing classes. And isolate those changes so that they affect only me and nobody else. Class boxes are finding their way into Ruby 2.0. There's a proposal, and there's even a patch for it, and they're called refinements instead of class boxes because there are subtle differences in semantics. But the idea is the same. Refinements would mean that I could define some awesome time extensions, like the ones that you hate and I think are awesome, and I can import them into an arbitrary lexical scope. Here we're importing them file-wide, but I could just as easily import them into a single class or a single method. And then other people's code doesn't have to see it at all. Only lexical scopes that have imported these refinements will see it.
Only lexical hubs that are importing those refinements here. Mm-hmm. Using time extensions. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's still not certain that this will make it into Ruby 2.0, but the response has been very positive. So if it's good enough for Ruby, why not JavaScript? The usual caveats apply for straw men, but here's how it might work. So inside a module block, you can use an extension key. We're able to say, but the silver lining is that we've got environments like Node now where people can use things as soon as they're implemented. It's not like client-side web development where you have to wait like 5 or 10 years before a feature is widely deployed enough that you can start using it. So I'm going to boldly predict that this will be in the language someday. Maybe 1,000 years from now, but someday. I'm optimistic about it because I'm tired of having these awesome features that we can't use. And I eagerly await a time when we can finally extend built-ins without the traditional downsides, at which point hopefully, we can stop having dumb arguments about this and apologize to each other for all the hurtful things that we've said and just get back to writing code. That's all I've got. We have time for a couple questions, I think. So the question was that a lot of my examples featured a sort of like domain-specific language type syntax and wondering whether built-in extension was the way to address that. And that's a valid point, and I shouldn't. But I don't think that my examples necessarily reflect like the breadth of what active support actually does with built-in extension. I'm all for other types of enhancements to support those kinds of things, like the proxy objects that we're getting in Harmony, and hopefully something that will replace with in a way that's not as awful as with, so that we can do more DSL type stuff. All right, if it's quick.
how would you say the efforts of common JS modules relate to your proposal of a standard polyfill of object outbind?
Common JS modules are interesting, and this was something that I cut out from the talk because I didn't really have time to address it. Yeah, like if I were writing a Node app, then like I imagine that I would have some module that I pull in that would do all of my built-in extension. I mean, that's the way that I would do it personally. It's also the case that there's the Node community is sort of experimenting with the idea of running modules in a sandbox where they can't even get at your built-ins. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that's going to play out over the next year or so. I mean, it's such a tiny piece of code that I think that people should inject into their environment however they like. All right, I'm out of time, but thank you all.
You know there are planes, Chris. We didn't have to take a wagon to Oregon.
Wait, what? That's enough, that's enough, that's enough. Okay, that's enough.
That people should inject into their environment however they like. All right, I'm out of time, but thank you all.
Andrew Dupont. Oh my god. Mm-hmm. 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 And that framework is called prototype. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Holy moly. Mm-hmm. Prototype code team. And I do think they abandoned that. Yep. They abandoned that particular project. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Event delegation. Mm-hmm. Project must include some form of unit, reference, implementation, or functional testing. Use cases demos do not qualify as tests. White space, diggy, table of content. Code quality tools, resource and reference. Important non-idiomatic stuff. Yes, code sniffer. Hone. Hone CI. Even for GitLab. And Sonar QB. Code quality and security. In your CI and CD, which is now enforcing that. Okay. Okay. Well, anyways, DRM free. Okay, so that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.